Ukraine regains territory in its northeastern Kharkiv region. Is the counteroffensive a game changer in the conflict, or is Kiev overstating its gains? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Kharkiv. In one article after another, Western media and pundits have described Ukraine's operation into Kharkiv as a lightning advance, a one-two punch, even the greatest counteroffensive since World War II. But is it? It's hard to say, since Ukraine hasn't allowed journalists access to the front lines. And buried in even the most glowing of reporting are caveats that state Ukraine's claims can't be fully verified. U.S. officials won't even speculate off the record whether the operation is a success. And in the meantime, the fighting rages on, sowing doubt on both sides as to who's really winning this conflict. Here's Ahad Al-Fadli with more.
200 days into the conflict, Ukrainian forces say they've made sweeping gains into the northeast of the country. At the center of the operation, a swift counter-offensive that led to the recapture of Kharkiv, Ukraine's second most populated city. As Russian troops abandoned their positions, leaving behind tanks, ammunition, and military equipment, Ukrainian troops posted video of themselves on social media, raising their flags in liberated villages and towns.
The liberation of settlements from the Russian invaders in the Kharkiv and Donetsk regions continues. As previously reported, during the retreat, Russian troops quickly abandoned their positions and fled deep into the temporarily occupied territories or the Russian Federation's territory.
Kiev claims it has recaptured nearly 6,000 square kilometers of territory, including the city of Izium, a major Russian military hub. It's not possible to verify those claims since journalists aren't allowed on the front lines. But a Russian representative did offer a tepid acknowledgement that his forces had suffered a setback.
I can say that it's completely right that Ukrainian troops' advances were just photo ops. It would probably be irresponsible of me to say that they have not achieved any successes at all. The very fact that they broke through our defense line is, of course, a significant victory for them.
Russia also says its troops haven't retreated, but are regrouping, and there are reports that fighting continues in the Kharkiv region over newly liberated villages and towns. Russian forces also responded to Ukrainian gains by attacking water and power supplies in Kharkiv. It's caused a total blackout, bringing the region to a grinding halt.
The Russian aerospace forces, missile forces, and artillery continue to deliver precision strikes against units and reserves of the armed forces of Ukraine in the Kharkiv region.
But if the Ukrainian gains are accurate, it's the biggest defeat for Moscow since forces pulled out of Kiev in April. It could also signal that there may be a turning point in the conflict. Ahad Fadli, The Newsmakers.
So is Ukraine's offensive a victory and turning point for Kiev, or just a setback for Moscow? Joining me now to debate that are from Washington, William Courtney. He is the former special assistant to the U.S. president for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. From Kiev is Peter Zalmayev. He's the director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. And from Moscow, we have Sergey Markov, former deputy of Russia's State Duma and a professor at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. Thanks all so much for being with us. Peter, I'll start with you, and you can tell us why you're actually fully confident that what the government in Kiev says about this counteroffensive is true, and that it is not part of any PR offensive to try to arguably demoralize Russia and Russian troops.
Well, I think it's both. There's no, it's despite the fact that we call this particular war a hybrid sort of war, and the way Vladimir Putin has sort of claimed credit for pioneering a hybrid warfare. Wars have always been of a hybrid nature. There's no strictly military war without its PR component. As you mentioned it, the New York Times has now just come out with a story about how Ukraine is calling on Russian soldiers to surrender en masse. It has not been able to verify all the claims of the Ukrainian side of cases of surrender. And I'm not here, about to tell you that I do know that. Apparently, there have been cases. I'm not sure how massive. But this propaganda, I think, has all the chance to work, because what is not, a conjecture, but a simple, straightforward fact is that Ukraine, in the last week, has been able to regain 3,400 square miles, and that's been confirmed by the likes of the New York Times. That is more territory than Russia was able to conquer in the last 5 months. So what we're seeing is the Ukrainian army, which is outgunned, outnumbered by what is Vladimir Putin has said all along that is the world's second largest army. Ukraine is showing this second largest army a lesson on how to fight wars. We are seeing, once again, a huge disparity in the fighting spirit. The Ukrainians know what they're fighting for, and those Russian soldiers who have surrendered and have been interrogated have said that they did not even know where they were going. They were not prepared. They were not told what they would be doing in Ukraine. So here we have the result.
So, Peter, why not let journalists in, at least closer to the front line, so they can verify that, you feel this is a victory for Ukraine, it's highly significant? Why not let the journalists in to verify it?
There's been a gag order that extends not just to foreign journalists, but to local journalists. And the Ukrainian, the general headquarters of the army have said that they've learned their lesson the hard way. The first few months of the war, there was just too much information, too much manipulation, and a lot of this information got out to the enemy. And so they are, they have cracked down for this very reason. But I understand that soon we may expect that to loosen up, because they also do realize that there needs to be some sort of a verification of all the claims. So I expect these rules to loosen up somewhat in the next few days.
Okay. Sergey, in the meantime, Russia simply says it's regrouping. So is this just a setback? Should Ukraine prepare for some kind of onslaught now?
Russia officially talking about regrouping, but unofficially it's absolutely clear that it's a failure of Russian army and victory of Ukrainian army. Now we have intensive discussion in Russia what should be changed. It's this victory of Ukrainian army look like victory of Nazi regime of Adolf Hitler in Ardennes, who beaten American and British troops very sufficiently. And the main reason of this victory of Ukrainian army is regarded as that Ukrainian army twice more on the front than Russian army. It's paradox, because Russian population 5 times more now than Ukrainian population. But nevertheless, Ukrainian army twice more than Russian. It's because Ukraine is totalitarian state right now, which is created by United States and Great Britain, and Ukraine have a few waves of the mass mobilization, but Russia have no one mass mobilization. And the main conclusion in Moscow now that Russia should stop special military operation and to start a real war, and to send much more troops on the Ukrainian front for the victory.
So is it just a matter of time before Russia stops actually describing this as a special military operation and declares this a war?
It's I don't know how it will be clear, but it's absolutely what should be announced by officially. But what's absolutely clear is that a Russian army which will be sent will be much more than now.
Okay. William Courtney, let me just ask you what you expect now in the very near term. Do you fear what Russia might do next, or do you think this latest round has actually given Ukraine the upper hand?
Ukrainian forces have made tremendous advances, more than expected. By advertising that it was going to conduct counteroffensive in the south, in the Kherson region, Russian forces moved some of their men and material down to south, leaving their forces weaker up in the north. So Ukraine, in this case, carried out a deceptive, successful operation and has really made military gains that no one in the West expected on this scale so quickly. Ukraine is now in a position to cut some of the key supply lines for Russian military forces further south because of the gains it has just made. It is not possible to predict what's going to happen next, either by the Ukrainian side or the Russian side. But what we are seeing is a democracy in which people are loyal and patriotic and voluntarily on their own, willing to fight for their country, to defend their freedom. And this has been an inspiring example.
So, I mean, we know Ukrainians have that crucial level of determination in this fight, but also how much has the supply of weapons from the West contributed to this, and should there be more military support now forthcoming?
The supply of weapons from the West has made a great deal of difference, but so too has the ability and willingness of Ukrainian troops to fight. After 2014, the first Russian invasion of Ukraine, NATO countries began a larger scale training and equipping program. And that is primarily training soldiers in how to do small unit tactics, to behave as a professional military force, to abide by standards that NATO troops, for example, abide by, and to have decentralized decision-making in a way that gives more agility to the forces, in contrast to the more rigid top-down Soviet style which Russian forces are using.
Peter, I mean, how much, in your estimation, does Ukraine need support-wise going forward?
Well, it needs enough to be able to start kicking the enemy out of the rest of the Donbass, Luhansk area, and Kherson, maybe even Crimea. That's going to be decided a little later. But you know what, and I agree with Mr. Courtney, the previous speaker. Ukraine has shown a decisive ability, to not only hold its line of defense, but to stage a successful counterattacks, to the point where, military experts are saying now that it seems that the Russian army, in its turn, has shown complete ineptitude when it comes to defensive actions, that it was only trained in a top-down manner to constantly go on attack, and it was caught completely flat-footed on the Kharkiv front when it was very badly and very thinly stretched along a very long front line, and so the Ukrainians explored and exploited this opportunity very successfully. So that should give a new impetus to the Western allies of Ukraine to give it all the weapons that it needs. And our chief general, Mr. Zaluzhny, wrote a very important piece the other day where he argues that the situation will start to change in Russia once the Russians start feeling some sort of effects of this war, which Vladimir Putin has so far been able to shield them from, which this means that Ukrainians have asked Americans to start supplying them with 300-kilometer ATACMS missiles in order to strike military objects within Russia. So that is going to be crucial for Ukraine to finally win this thing.
Okay. Sergey, speaking of Russians feeling the effect of this conflict, I need to ask you if you can speak honestly about the level of dissent that's been allowed in Russian media. We actually have a soundbite from one former opposition lawmaker. Let's first listen, and then I'd like you to tell me, if you can, how prevalent voices like his are.
People who convince President Putin that the special operation will be fast and effective, we won't strike the civilian population, will come in, and our National Guard, along with Kadyrovites, will bring things to order. These people really set all of us up.
Are you sure these people exist?
Of course, the president didn't just sit there and think, why don't I start a special operation? Someone told him that Ukrainians will surrender, that they will flee, that they will want to join Russia. Someone had to be telling him all this. They also said the same on TV. We're now at the point when we have to understand it's absolutely impossible to defeat Ukraine using those resources and colonial war methods with which Russia is trying to wage war, using contract soldiers, mercenaries, no mobilization. A strong army is opposing the Russian army, fully supported by the most powerful countries in the economic and technological sense, including European countries.
Are you suggesting military mobilization?
I'm suggesting peace talks about stopping the war.
Sergey, is a voice like that an anomaly in Russia right now, or are more and more people speaking along those terms?
Boris Nadezhdin, a very good friend of mine. I will tell that you quoted him so a long time. And Boris Nadezhdin, for many years, he is a pro-Western politician. And Russia, free country. In Russia, people can say, we want Russia to stop war. It's absolutely too impossible to do it in Ukraine, because Ukraine is a totalitarian country created by such people like Peter. And but we, Russia, free country, we can do it. There are some people who continue to tell this, that we don't need this military operation. It's something about 10% about them. Most of them live in Moscow and St. Petersburg and the big megapolises. But majority of the people believe on contrary, that Russia should continue its military operation against neo-Nazi regime in Ukraine, which have been created by people like Peter. And Russia should escalate its military activity. Russia has limited mobilization. Russia should have more army. And Vladimir Putin has a lot of information what happening. But war doesn't include only victories. Sometimes in the war, failure can happen as well.
Let me give Peter a quick response, and then I want to give... Yeah, very quickly. Go ahead.
Sergey gives me too much credit. I didn't create anything. I'm just a citizen, and we, by comparison, have actually the freedom to say whatever we want to say, as opposed to my, I'm sorry.
You cannot say. You cannot say that you want peace. You cannot say that you want peace.
I want peace. I want peace on Ukraine's terms, which means restoring Ukraine's borders to its 1991, borders. That's all we want. We do want, and I can say that. Let me just, Mr. Markov.
Very quickly, Peter, and then I want to get to William Courtney. Sergey, I know you completely disagree, and you feel the Ukrainian regime, I'm quoting you, Sergey, you say the Ukrainian regime actually suppresses all the opposition that you believe would defend Russian interest in Ukraine. Peter, very quickly, go ahead, finish your statement. I need to get to William.
I'll just say this. Vladimir Putin knows that right now the war is pretty much lost. There's no momentum anymore. And the reason he's not ordering mobilization, contrary to what his right-wing nationalist critics are calling him to do, is because he probably knows the true opinion and the true feeling of the Russians, who are willing, sitting in their armchairs in front of TVs, to support the war sort of as an idea. But when it comes to sending their children, their sons, to die for it, he probably knows that there's no willingness to do it. They don't think that this is a righteous war. This is the deep down feeling, and he knows it, and that's why it's not happening.
Okay. As for the prospect of peace talks, William Courtney, that was mentioned, and then that soundbite we just heard, do you think there is room for negotiations, especially given what Peter said about returning to the borders of 1991? The negotiations would obviously be over the Luhansk and Donetsk, which Russia thinks should be, at the very least, I'm assuming, conceded to Russia. I mean, if that's the starting point, what are the prospects really for peace talks going forward?
The battlefield is too dynamic for peace talks. Whether in this war, fluid battlefields and other wars too. You can't really do peace talks in that circumstance. Usually, peace talks work when the sides become exhausted with fighting. Right now, the Ukrainians believe, and the West supports them, that they can retake all of the territory, including all of Donetsk and Luhansk, and that they can retake Crimea. Until this war, a lot of people in the West thought that Crimea was lost for a long time to Russia. Now that's all changed. So there is not likely to be any productive peace talk until the battlefield, if you will, settles down, and then we see where the battle lines are at that time.
Okay, what you've said really does not bode well for any of this fighting wrapping up at any time. So, I mean, how could Russia even really unwind itself from this conflict now? I mean, some have described it as a quagmire. Where would even be, again, the starting point for that?
Russia will probably at some point have to face the decision whether to pull out entirely if Ukraine continues its battlefield advances. This war has been a debacle for Russia. It is something that probably in a category of strategic blunders by great powers, very few exceed this. So Ukraine is likely, right at this point, to gain back more territory and may gain all of the territory that was lost in 2014 with very strong Western support. Russia may be in, let's say, a situation in which regime change in a liberalizing direction is more likely. Without that kind of liberalizing regime change and a total pullout from Ukraine, the Western sanctions, which are very punishing, those sanctions are likely to continue.
Okay. Sergey, I want to get your take on that. The sanctions, Russians have actually argued that they've backfired because it's brought more unity among the Russian people in this fight, and they've been able to buck, the negative side effects that the sanctions were supposed to have to a much larger extent. But I also want to ask you, historically, do Russians perhaps see this battle now in Ukraine as similar to what they fought for in Chechnya? They lost the first round, but came back to not just take Chechnya, but help form a very pro-Moscow government in Grozny.
Yes, there are a lot of comparison of situation in Ukraine with Chechnya. And also, it was some nationalism, both Ukrainian and Chechen nationalism. But the main problem for Russia is not this nationalism, but invasion from outside. In Chechnya, it was a combination of the radical Islamist, like Islamic State and Daesh, on one hand, and Western intelligence services on another hand, which cooperating with each other. On Ukraine, it's without radical Islamists, only NATO intelligence service and defense minister and so on. So it's we regard each area and Ukraine as occupied country. We don't see any Ukrainian government, any Ukrainian army. Ukrainian army is proxy army of the United States and Britain. And we believe that if Russian army will take control of those Ukrainian territories, people from Odessa, Kharkiv, Kiev, Zaporozhye, Nikolaev will be same Russian patriots as Russian patriots, Chechen fighters right now. So we believe that it's exactly will happen. And Hezbollah is very good comparison of Ukrainian army. Both combination of both countries, totalitarian countries, and both armies as proxy army. Hezbollah is proxy of Iran, and Ukrainian army proxy of United States.
Okay, Peter, I can give you about a minute for some final thoughts.
Yeah, I'll just say this: this is a very tricky situation for Vladimir Putin. Because not only is he criticized obviously by those who are against war, most of them have been shut up essentially or arrested. or fled the country. But now, as you have seen, you have shown on before, there have appeared critics on the right side of Vladimir Putin, including Mr. Kadyrov, the ruler of Chechnya, who's now aspiring to be a big shot in Moscow. So I wouldn't be surprised if at some point they decide that enough, we need a stronger hand, and they would overthrow Vladimir Putin. Precisely for his, for being too soft on Ukraine. And this is a very major blunder, what Mr. Courtney just said, also because Vladimir Putin is essentially undermining his basic message to the Russians all these years: stability and a strong hand. He is now, demonstrating a very weak and indecisive hand simply because he lacks the resources, simply because he was not prepared enough to go against a country the size of Ukraine. This has been a major miscalculation, and this will not end well for him.
Peter Zalmayev, that will have to be the final word. I'd like to thank William Courtney and Sergey Markov, of course, for joining us on this edition of The Newsmakers. Great to have all three of you, and great to have our viewers as well. Thanks so much for tuning in. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter @_Newsmakers, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.